My son banned me from his wedding, but sent me a bill for $250,000 to pay for his party and honeymoon. He even cheekily added, "Be thankful I let you contribute." I just smiled and turned his dream into a nightmare. My name is James Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. I was sitting at my heavy mahogany desk on a quiet gray Tuesday afternoon. The relentless Seattle rain was beating against the thick floor-to-ceiling windows of my private office. From up here on the 40th floor, I could look out over the gray water and see the massive cargo ships slowly pulling into the harbor. Those ships bore the bold, unmistakable logo of Caldwell Global Freight. My company, my life's work. I was in the middle of reviewing a $15 million shipping contract with a major European distributor. It was a standard, straightforward deal, the kind of numbers I handle before my second cup of black coffee. 45 years ago, I was sweeping warehouse floors, driving forklifts, and unloading heavy wooden crates until my hands bled. I built this empire penny by penny, working 80-hour weeks, so my late wife Diane and our only son Bradley would never have to know the bitter, freezing bite of poverty. I was just reaching for my favorite fountain pen to sign the final page of the European contract when the soft chime of my private office doors interrupted me. My executive assistant stepped inside, looking slightly confused. She walked over and handed me a thick, heavy envelope. It was made of premium cream cardstock lined with crushed navy velvet sealed with a ridiculous gold wax stamp. It screamed luxury. It screamed old money. I knew immediately it had to do with Bradley. He was getting married in exactly 1 month to a woman named Tiffany Kensington. Tiffany. She was a woman who claimed to be from the absolute elite of Chicago society. Her manners always felt a bit too rehearsed to me, a bit too eager. But Bradley was completely and utterly blinded by her. At 32 years old, sitting as the vice president of operations in my own building, my son walked around like he owned the world. I took the velvet-lined envelope from my assistant, fully expecting to pull out the heavy embossed wedding invitation I had been waiting weeks to receive. Diane and I used to talk about this day all the time. Before cancer took her from me 4 years ago, we would sit on our back porch with a glass of wine and imagine watching our boy stand at the altar. I thanked my assistant, waited for the heavy glass doors to close behind her, and slid my silver letter opener through the thick, expensive paper. Inside the velvet lining, there was no beautifully engraved invitation. There was no beautifully scripted response card. There was a single piece of heavy corporate stationery with an ornate gold-foiled logo at the top, reading Kensington Royal Events Limited Liability Company. Below that logo was an invoice. I slowly pushed my silver reading glasses up the bridge of my nose and stared at the numbers printed in stark black ink. $250,000. The amount was due immediately upon receipt. For a long moment, the rhythmic sound of the Seattle rain faded completely away. I looked at the invoice again, my mind struggling to process the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the document resting on my desk. $250,000 for a wedding reception and a luxury honeymoon package. Tucked neatly behind the ridiculous invoice was a small handwritten note on Bradley's personal custom stationery. I recognized his messy, hurried scrawl instantly. I picked it up and read the words, and with every single syllable a cold, heavy stone dropped further into the pit of my stomach. Dad, the note read, "Tiffany's family guest list is entirely VIPs. We are talking high-level politicians, corporate socialites, and people who actually matter. Your blue-collar vibe just does not fit the aesthetic we are going for, so we think it is best you sit this one out. Please wire the funds to the company account by Friday. Be thankful I let you contribute." I read it a second time, then a third. Be thankful I let you contribute. This was my own flesh and blood. The boy I had taught to ride a bicycle in the park. The young man whose expensive Ivy League tuition I had paid in full in cash without a single complaint. He was officially banning me from the most important day of his life because the calluses on my hands and the grit in my voice might offend his fiancée's snobby friends. He was locking me out of the celebration, effectively erasing me from his life, but leaving the door cracked just enough to slide his greedy hand into my wallet. The absolute disrespect was suffocating. I did not yell. I did not throw the $15 million contract across the room. I did not smash my ceramic coffee mug against the wall. The heartbreak of a father was certainly there, manifesting as a deep, agonizing ache right in the center of my chest. I thought of my sweet Diane. I thought of how she would weep uncontrollably if she saw what our beloved son had become. But the grief and the shock only lasted for about 60 seconds, because right behind that grief the primal instincts of a self-made billionaire violently kicked in. The survival instincts of a lone wolf who had navigated decades of cutthroat corporate warfare took over my mind. You do not build a global logistics empire from nothing by letting arrogant people walk all over you even if those people share your last name. In the shipping business, when a vessel goes off course, you do not sit back and cry about the lost cargo. You immediately take control of the wheel and course correct. I placed the handwritten note carefully beside the outrageous invoice, making sure the edges aligned perfectly with my pristine blotter pad. I leaned back in my leather executive chair, taking a slow, deep breath, letting the cold, calculating side of my brain take the wheel. I reached across the desk and picked up my desk phone. I dialed Bradley's direct office extension. He was just 3 floors down, living a life of unparalleled luxury, a life funded entirely by the exact same man he had just deemed too low class to attend his own wedding. The phone rang once. It rang twice. I sat perfectly still, looking at the heavy rain sliding down the thick glass of my windows, listening to the electronic tone, patiently waiting for my son to answer the line. I was completely ready to hear the smooth, plausible lie I knew he had carefully prepared for me. The telephone line connected with a sharp electronic click. Background noise filtered through the receiver immediately. I heard the clinking of crystal glassware and a muted string quartet. Bradley answered the phone, but there was absolutely no warmth in his greeting. He let out a loud sigh into the mouthpiece like a frustrated parent dealing with a stubborn toddler. Dad, I am in the middle of a very important menu tasting with the executive chef. What is so urgent that it cannot wait until tomorrow morning? I kept my voice perfectly flat, stripping away any tray of the betrayal burning inside my chest. I received your invoice, Bradley. $250,000. And a note telling me I am banned from my only child's wedding. I simply want to understand what I am paying for. There was a tense pause on his end. I heard him shifting his weight, stepping away to find a quiet corner. When he spoke again, his tone was slick, coated in that rehearsed corporate polish I had paid hundreds of thousands for him to perfect. Dad, you have to look at the bigger picture here. This is not just a simple party. This is a networking event of the highest caliber. Tiffany's family belongs to a completely different world. We are hosting this reception at the Ritz-Carlton, and the security protocols alone are astronomically expensive. We have high-ranking politicians and generational wealth attending this weekend. The venue demands a massive VIP security retainer to ensure privacy for these guests. It is just how high society works. You would not understand the delicate nuances of these elite circles. His words were meticulously designed to make me feel small. He was trying to make me feel like an uneducated dock worker rather than the billionaire CEO I was today. He wanted me to feel grateful that he was allowing me to finance his entry into Chicago society. I leaned forward, resting my elbows heavily on the cool, polished mahogany of my desk. $250,000 for security and aesthetic upgrades, Bradley. That is $250,000 wired to an LLC I have never heard of. Why am I not paying the Ritz-Carlton directly for these services? Another rehearsed sigh crackled through the speaker. Because Kensington Royal Events handles the private vendor disbursements. It is an exclusive boutique concierge service Tiffany's family uses to maintain absolute privacy. These people require strict non-disclosure agreements, Dad. We cannot just write a check to the hotel. We have to funnel the funds through the event planners to shield the identities of our guests. This is standard procedure for wealth management. I know you are used to doing things the old-fashioned way, handing over cash on the loading docks, but this is the modern elite. You are embarrassing me by questioning this process. I need you to wire the funds by Friday so we do not lose our critical deposits. Before I could dissect the gaping holes in his ridiculous explanation, I heard the rustling of the phone changing hands. A sharp, melodic laugh echoed through the receiver. It was Tiffany. Her voice was dripping with a sickeningly sweet, fake warmth that made the hairs on my arms stand straight up. "Oh, James, I am so sorry you feel left out of the festivities. Bradley told me you were upset, but you really have to understand our delicate position. You are such a practical, hard-working man, and we love that about you, we truly do. But this weekend is going to be incredibly refined. We have 3 state senators coming. We have board members from the largest banks in the country. It is a highly curated environment." I tightened my grip on the phone, my knuckles turning white, but I did not interrupt her. I let her continue digging her own grave with her poisonous words. "It is just that your working-class hero stories are so charming for a corporate company picnic, James. But at a formal black tie gala, it would just make our guests feel profoundly uncomfortable. You would feel entirely out of place among these people, and we genuinely do not want you to feel awkward. You understand that, right? We are actually doing this to protect your feelings and save you from social embarrassment. But please do not worry, we hired an incredible award-winning videographer. We will send you a beautifully edited video of the ceremony so you can watch it from your living room. It will be almost exactly like you are right there with us." The sheer, unadulterated disrespect in her voice was absolutely breathtaking. She was speaking to a man who had built a logistics empire from nothing, treating me like an embarrassing relative who needed to be hidden away. She thought she was so much smarter than me. They both did. They truly believed I was just a walking, breathing checkbook, a foolish old man eager to buy their superficial affection. I swallowed the thick, burning lump of anger in my throat. I forced my vocal cords to completely relax, projecting the exact image of the defeated, compliant father they were fully expecting to hear. "I see," I said slowly, letting a heavy hint of weary resignation slip perfectly into my voice. "Well, I certainly would not want to ruin your carefully curated aesthetic, or embarrass you in front of the state senators and the diplomats. You are right. It is probably best I stay here in Seattle and let you two enjoy your very special weekend without my interference." I could practically hear the triumphant, arrogant smiles forming on their faces across the country. Tiffany let out a delighted, high-pitched little squeal. "I knew you would understand, James. You are so incredibly generous. Bradley is so incredibly lucky to have a father who supports our vision without making a fuss. We will look out for the wire transfer on Friday." I took one final steady breath, staring at the relentless rain lashing against the thick glass of my office window. "I will alert my accounting team right away," I told them softly. "Enjoy your tasting." I hung up the phone and placed the receiver gently back onto its cradle. The absolute heavy silence of my office rushed back in, broken only by the steady drum of the storm outside. I did not move for a very long time. I just sat there replaying every single word of that toxic conversation in my mind. The condescension, the lies, the blatant manipulation. They had played their parts perfectly, spinning a web of deceit they thought was completely impenetrable. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot who they were dealing with. I picked up the velvet-lined invoice again, studying the cheap ink printed on the expensive paper. Kensington Royal Events Limited Liability Company. $250,000 requested for high society discretion. It was a flawless facade meant to blind me with elitism. I pulled my computer keyboard closer. The first domino had just fallen, and I was about to trace all the money. I pushed my keyboard closer. The first domino had just fallen, and I was about to trace all the money. I flattened the crisp cream cardstock of the invoice onto my leather blotter. The gold-foiled logo of Kensington Royal Events Limited Liability Company gleamed under the soft, ambient light. It looked expensive, designed to project exclusivity. But when you have spent 45 years navigating the unforgiving waters of the international shipping industry, you learn a valuable lesson. A shiny coat of paint is almost always used to hide a rapidly rusting hull. I reached into my top drawer and retrieved a small silver magnifying glass I occasionally used to inspect microscopic print on customs manifests. I hovered the glass over the bottom left corner of the document. There, buried in a tiny font deliberately designed to be ignored, was the official billing address for the company. It was not a prestigious suite on the Magnificent Mile in Chicago. It was not a luxury corporate park in Manhattan. It was a street address with a suite number located in Carson City, Nevada. Nevada, the state famous for its lenient corporate tax laws and absolute anonymity for business owners. It was the perfect place to register a company if you wanted to hide who was actually pulling the financial strings. I typed the address into the search bar on my computer and pulled up the satellite street view. My screen rendered an image of a bleak, sun-baked strip mall. The suite number corresponded to an unmarked storefront sandwiched tightly between a discount auto parts shop and a vacant grocery store with boarded-up windows. This was supposedly the headquarters of an exclusive boutique service. It was an absolute farce. I set the silver magnifying glass down, turning my attention to the itemized charges. Decades of building Caldwell Global Freight had trained my brain to see numbers as concrete realities. You do not conquer the global logistics market if you cannot instantly calculate the exact cost of maritime fuel dock labor and international tariffs for a massive cargo ship. My mind automatically began to completely dissect the proposed budget for Bradley and Tiffany's wedding. They had invited exactly 150 guests. I knew this because I had secured the initial room blocks at the hotel. $250,000 divided by 150 guests equated to more than $1,600 per person. Even at a luxury venue like the Ritz-Carlton, factoring in premium open bars, exotic florals, a live orchestra, and the massive VIP security detail, Bradley described that figure was mathematically absurd. The budget was not just significantly inflated, it was completely wildly fabricated. The numbers practically screamed that a massive theft was taking place. I picked up my smartphone and opened my contact directory. I have held an elite Platinum 5 IP status with the Ritz-Carlton Enterprise for nearly 15 years. Over the decades, I have hosted massive corporate galas, international shipping summits, and multi-million-dollar charity banquets in their grand ballrooms. I know their general managers by their first names. I scrolled down to the contact information for the executive event coordinator of their premier Chicago property, a sharp, meticulously organized woman named Sarah. I tapped her direct number, placing the phone to my ear as I stared out at the relentless Seattle rain. When Sarah answered the line, her voice was warm and impeccably professional. I immediately shifted my demeanor, adopting the gentle, slightly anxious tone of a generous father who just wanted to make absolutely certain his only son's wedding day was going to be perfect. "Good afternoon, Sarah," I said, keeping my voice smooth and pleasant. "This is James Caldwell. I am calling regarding my son Bradley's wedding reception scheduled for next month. I am the one financing the event, and I just wanted to touch base to confirm a few of the finer details on the aesthetic front." "Oh, Mr. Caldwell, it is a pleasure to hear from you," Sarah replied warmly, the sound of her keyboard clicking rapidly in the background as she pulled up the event file. "We are so excited to host Bradley and Tiffany. Everything is progressing beautifully. How can I assist you today?" "Well," I explained smoothly, letting out a small, good-natured chuckle. "I recently received the finalized invoice from the wedding planners, Kensington Royal Events. As a businessman, I always like to cross-reference the major expenditures. I just want to ensure that the massive floral installations and the premium VIP security detail they invoiced me for have been fully cleared and approved by your security team. We certainly would not want any logistical hiccups on the big day." There was a sudden, distinct pause on the other end of the line. The rapid clicking of Sarah's keyboard abruptly stopped. I could sense the immediate confusion radiating through the phone. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, her professional tone wavering just slightly. "I am looking at the master event file for the Caldwell reception right now. I do not have any vendor by the name of Kensington Royal Events registered for this occasion. Furthermore, the couple opted to handle the floral arrangements through our in-house basic vendor list, not an external luxury designer." I kept my silence, letting her words hang heavily in the air. The picture was becoming clearer by the second, and it was significantly uglier than I could have ever anticipated. And regarding the security detail, Sarah continued, sounding increasingly perplexed. "There is no VIP security protocol attached to this event. In fact, the couple selected our standard classic reception package. The total projected cost for the ballroom catering and basic amenities is roughly $35,000. Not to mention, sir, we are currently holding a pending status on the account because the initial $10,000 deposit they submitted yesterday was unfortunately returned by the bank due to insufficient funds." The silence in my office grew deafening. $35,000 for the entire event. A bounced $10,000 deposit. Yet my son and his future bride had confidently handed me an invoice for $250,000, claiming it was an absolute necessity for their high society connections. The remaining $215,000 was pure phantom money. It was ghost capital meant to vanish seamlessly into the shadowy Nevada bank account of a shell company created solely to extract my hard-earned wealth. I did not gasp. I did not express my shock to the event coordinator. I maintained my calm, unwavering composure, a skill perfected over thousands of hours sitting across negotiation tables from ruthless corporate sharks. "I understand, Sarah," I replied gently, projecting an aura of complete control. "It appears there has simply been a minor administrative miscommunication between my son's external financial advisors and my personal accounting department. Please do not worry about the bounced deposit. I will have my corporate finance team wire the outstanding $35,000 directly to the hotel's account by the end of the business day tomorrow to secure the ballroom. Let us keep this brief administrative correction between us so we do not unnecessarily stress the happy couple." Sarah sounded deeply relieved to have the financial issue resolved so effortlessly. "Thank you so much, Mr. Caldwell. I will make a note in the file and look out for the direct wire transfer. We are looking forward to hosting your family." I thanked her graciously and ended the call. I placed the phone face down on my desk, my mind racing with cold, crystalline clarity. The wedding was a smokescreen. The entire event was nothing more than a carefully constructed theatrical performance designed to obscure a massive financial extraction. My own son, the boy I had raised with every advantage in the world, had looked me dead in the eye and demanded $250,000 to pay off some mysterious debt, all while mocking my background and banning me from the room. But a new, more disturbing question immediately surfaced in my mind. What kind of debt could possibly drive a 32-year-old corporate vice president to attempt to defraud his own billionaire father through a fake event planning company? Bradley earned a very generous 6-figure salary. He lived in a luxury condominium that I had personally provided the down payment for. He drove a pristine imported sports car. He lacked absolutely nothing. Where was his money actually going? I turned my chair to face the secondary monitor on my desk, connected to the secure internal network of Caldwell Global Freight. As the founder, my credentials granted me unrestricted access to every financial account, corporate ledger, and expense report inside it. I logged into the portal, my fingers flying rapidly across the keys. I needed to see exactly how my vice president had been utilizing the resources entrusted to him. The heavy security firewall of the Caldwell Global Freight financial portal requires dual authentication. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner on my desk, watching the small indicator light flip from a sterile red to a welcoming green. The system opened, revealing the sprawling digital architecture of my life's work. Columns of numbers, international wire transfers, and departmental budgets populated the dual screens. I navigated past the global logistics dashboards, bypassing the European and Asian shipping ledgers, and clicked directly into the executive expense portfolios. My heart was a cold, steady drum in my chest. I located the specific financial directory assigned to the Vice President of Operations. I clicked on Bradley's name. As the detailed transaction history loaded, the magnitude of the lie settled over me like a suffocating winter fog. $250,000. That was the amount printed on the fake velvet-lined invoice sitting beside my keyboard. Yet as Sarah from the Ritz-Carlton had just explicitly confirmed, the actual wedding package was a mere $35,000. Even worse, my son did not even have the liquidity to cover a basic $10,000 deposit. The check had bounced. A vice president earning a multi-million-dollar compensation package, living in a penthouse I helped secure, driving a car worth more than most people's homes, could not scrape together $10,000 in cash. Where was his money going? It made absolutely no sense. If the luxury hotel was not getting paid, and the caterers were not getting paid, and the imaginary VIP security teams were not getting paid, then the requested $250,000 was meant to be funneled directly into that shady Nevada shell company. It was ghost capital. It was a complete phantom wedding designed specifically to extract a massive sum of liquid cash from my personal reserves. I stared at the rows of recent expenditures on Bradley's corporate card, scrolling back through the last 6 months of his financial activity. Initially, the ledger appeared to be nothing more than the typical, albeit excessive, spending habits of a deeply spoiled young executive. There were exorbitant charges at high-end Chicago steakhouses, frequent flights to Miami, and massive tabs at exclusive nightclubs. It was infuriating, certainly, but it did not explain the sheer desperation required to invent a fake billing company and attempt to extort $250,000 from his own father. People do not risk federal wire fraud to pay for expensive dinners. They risk federal wire fraud when they are backed into a terrifying, inescapable corner. I needed to dig deeper. I adjusted my silver reading glasses and applied a series of advanced forensic filters to the expense portal, isolating any transaction exceeding $5,000 that lacked a corresponding vendor approval code. My shipping company processes thousands of legitimate invoices daily, so anomalies are usually flagged by our automated software. However, Bradley had supreme executive override privileges. He could bypass the standard accounting checkpoints, forcing payments through the system before the automated audits could catch them. I watched the screen flicker as the search parameters executed. A moment later, a condensed list of highly irregular transactions populated the screen. My eyes locked onto a charge placed just 2 weeks ago. $15,000 wired directly to a firm called Sinclair and Vance Legal Associates. I opened a new browser tab and searched the firm's name. The search results loaded instantly, and the knot in my stomach pulled agonizingly tight. Sinclair and Vance was not a corporate law firm specializing in logistics or maritime shipping contracts. They were not handling international trade negotiations for my company. Their sleek, professional website proudly advertised their primary areas of expertise. They were aggressive legal specialists dedicated exclusively to high-net-worth bankruptcy filings, severe asset protection, and defending clients against hostile debt collection. Why in the world would my son be secretly utilizing corporate funds to retain a bankruptcy lawyer? I continued scanning the flagged transactions, the illusion of my son's perfect, successful life shattering completely with every click of my mouse. Just 3 lines down from the bankruptcy firm was another inexplicable charge. This one was processed a mere 4 days ago. $5,000 paid to a company registered as Elite Cognitive Assessments. Once again, I highlighted the vendor name and initiated a background search. The website that appeared made my blood run absolutely cold. It was a private, discreet medical evaluation service located in the affluent suburbs of Chicago. They specialized in conducting rapid, confidential psychiatric and neurological evaluations for elderly individuals. Their primary marketing pitch was aimed at concerned family members seeking to establish legal guardianships or medical power of attorney over aging parents experiencing cognitive decline or severe dementia. I sat back in my heavy leather chair, the glow of the monitors casting long shadows across my office. The puzzle pieces were rapidly snapping together, forming a picture so utterly grotesque that it took my breath away. Bradley was not just drowning in some mysterious catastrophic debt. He and Tiffany were actively laying the legal groundwork to declare me mentally incompetent. The fake wedding invoice was likely just a desperate short-term cash grab to keep their most aggressive creditors at bay while they finalized their ultimate master plan. They intended to use that private medical evaluator to generate a fraudulent report regarding my mental health. Then, armed with a falsified diagnosis of dementia and a retained team of ruthless asset protection lawyers, they would launch a hostile takeover of my entire life. They wanted the authority to seize my bank accounts, liquidate my real estate, and ultimately take complete control of Caldwell Global Freight. The absolute depravity of their scheme was staggering. They had genuinely convinced themselves that I was nothing more than a foolish, deteriorating old man whose life's work was ripe for the taking. They believed I would simply write a check for $250,000 without asking a single question, proving their theory that my mind was already slipping. They assumed I would politely stay away from the wedding, sitting alone in my Seattle home, completely isolated and vulnerable, while they finalized the legal paperwork to strip me of my human rights and my fortune. I picked up my smartphone. My thumb hovered over the screen. It was time to test the waters to see exactly how much pressure the vice president of operations could handle before his carefully constructed facade began to crack. I opened my text message thread with Bradley. My message was short, professional, and mathematically precise. "I just reviewed the Kensington Royal Events invoice with my private accounting team," I typed, ensuring my tone was indistinguishable from my usual business communications. Due to the massive size of the requested transfer and the strict security protocols we maintain for out-of-state limited liability companies, the bank requires a mandatory 72-hour holding period for verification. The funds will not clear until Monday morning. Have a productive tasting. I pressed send and placed the phone face up on the mahogany wood. I did not have to wait long. Less than 30 seconds later, the screen illuminated with an incoming call from Bradley. I let it ring. I watched the caller identification flash across the glass, visualizing the sheer, unadulterated panic setting in behind his arrogant eyes. He called a second time. I ignored it. Then a rapid-fire barrage of text messages began to flood the screen, the notification chimes echoing sharply through the quiet office. "Dad, please pick up," the first message read. "We cannot wait until Monday. We will lose the VIP security deposits. The whole event will be ruined." A second message arrived moments later. "You need to call the bank manager and bypass the holding period. You are a billionaire. You can make an immediate wire transfer happen. Do not do this to us right now." I read the urgent new messages with absolute chilling detachment. The desperate, panicked tone contrasted completely against the incredibly arrogant young man who had previously commanded me to be eternally thankful. He was hopelessly trapped beneath the heavy, crushing weight of his own massive financial lies. I did not reply to him. I locked my personal smartphone and pocketed it. I reached for my corporate desk phone instead. I picked up the heavy corporate receiver and dialed the private direct line for Michael Thorne. Michael was not just the chief legal counsel for Caldwell Global Freight. He was a ruthlessly efficient, brilliant corporate attorney who had stood by my side for over 30 years. We had fought off hostile takeovers, navigated treacherous international trade disputes, and buried aggressive competitors together. He was a man who understood that in the upper echelons of wealth, trust was a vulnerability and loyalty was a highly priced commodity. The line rang only once before he answered. His voice was sharp and alert, completely accustomed to my sudden high-stakes demands. James Michael said, the background noise of his busy legal department instantly going quiet as he closed his office door. "What do you need?" Cancel your afternoon appointments, Michael. I instructed, my voice maintaining that unnatural, icy calm that only surfaces when a catastrophic betrayal has been unearthed. I need you in my office right now. Bring your absolute best forensic accounting team and call in the private investigative unit we keep on retainer for corporate espionage. Bring the people who know how to dig through concrete. I heard the immediate shift in his breathing. Are we under a corporate attack? Is it the European merger? No, I replied, the bitter reality of the situation tasting like ash in my mouth. It is much worse than that. I am being hunted by my own blood. Give me 20 minutes, Michael stated firmly, and the line went dead. Exactly 18 minutes later, the heavy glass doors to my executive suite swung open. Michael strode into the room flanked by 3 serious-looking professionals carrying secure laptops and encrypted hard drives. He took one look at my face and motioned for his team to immediately set up at the large mahogany conference table situated on the far side of my office. I stood up from my desk carrying the velvet-lined wedding invoice, the printouts of Bradley's corporate credit card expenses, and my personal smartphone containing the frantic text messages. I laid the documents out on the polished wood like evidence at a murder trial. Bradley handed me this invoice this morning. I began pointing to the glittering gold logo of Kensington Royal Events. $250,000 for his wedding reception. He explicitly banned me from attending the event, claiming my presence would offend the delicate sensibilities of his elite future in-laws. But the Ritz-Carlton just confirmed their actual wedding package is $35,000, and Bradley's $10,000 deposit bounced yesterday. Michael picked up the luxurious paper, his experienced eyes scanning the fraudulent billing details, a shell company in Nevada. This is incredibly sloppy work for a vice president. It gets worse. I continued sliding the expense reports across the table. He used his corporate executive card to pay $15,000 to a ruthless bankruptcy law firm and $5,000 to a private off-the-books medical evaluator specializing in rapid dementia diagnoses for the elderly. He is desperately demanding the $250,000 by Friday, claiming the entire wedding will collapse without it. Michael's jaw tightened as the implications of the documents settled over the room. He turned to his lead forensic investigator, a quiet, intensely focused woman named Sarah. I want a complete microscopic dissection of Tiffany Kensington and her entire family. Tear down every single wall of their supposedly elite Chicago background. Find out exactly where this $250,000 is meant to go. The conference room transformed into a high-tech command center. For 2 agonizing hours, the only sounds in the room were the rapid, relentless clicking of keyboards and the steady, rhythmic pounding of the Seattle rain against the windows. I stood by the glass looking out over the harbor, watching my massive cargo ships load and unload thousands of steel containers. I had built an empire capable of moving millions of tons of freight across the most dangerous oceans on the planet, yet I had somehow failed to see the treacherous storm brewing inside my own home. I had given Bradley everything. I had paid for his luxury condominium, funded his Ivy League education, and handed him a prestigious executive title. In return, he was plotting to declare me incompetent and steal my life's work. Mr. Caldwell, Sarah's voice broke through the heavy silence. We have the preliminary financial background on the Kensington family. You are going to want to see this. I walked over to the conference table. Sarah rotated her laptop screen so I could view the sprawling web of financial data she had uncovered. Tiffany Kensington's family is not old money Chicago elite. They are not politicians or high society socialites. The entire lineage is a carefully constructed, completely hollow fabrication. She tapped a key, bringing up a series of legal documents and public records. Her father, Richard Kensington, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy 4 years ago. The sprawling, luxury estate they love to post photographs of on social media. It does not belong to them. It is currently owned by a commercial bank, and there is an active foreclosure notice pending execution next Tuesday. The luxury vehicles they drive are all short-term, high-interest leases. If they are completely broke, why does Bradley need $250,000 in untraceable cash? Michael asked, narrowing his eyes at the screen. Because Richard Kensington has a severe undocumented gambling addiction, Sarah explained, pulling up a secondary encrypted file. Our investigators tapped into the underground financial networks. He owes roughly $220,000 to a highly organized, extremely dangerous, illicit gambling syndicate operating out of Las Vegas. The debt has been sold to aggressive collectors. If he does not pay the principal balance by the end of this month, the consequences will be severe and physical. The sheer audacity of the scheme washed over me in waves of cold realization. The fake wedding invoice, I whispered, staring at the screen. Tiffany is a grifter. She found a wealthy, arrogant, desperate mark in my son. She convinced Bradley that he needed to pay off her father's massive gambling debts under the guise of an elite high-society wedding package. They set up the Nevada Shell Company to wash my corporate funds and funnel the money directly to the loan sharks. It is pure extortion dressed up in white lace and champagne, Michael said, shaking his head in absolute disgust. But James, that only explains the $250,000. It explains why the venue deposit bounced, because every available cent Bradley has is likely being drained by Tiffany's family. But it does not explain the bankruptcy lawyers. And it certainly does not explain why your son is secretly hiring private dementia evaluators. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as the final horrifying puzzle piece clicked firmly into place. I turned back to Sarah, my voice dropping to a dangerous, barely audible whisper. Bypass my son's corporate email encryption system entirely. Dig through all his secure internal communications. Do it right now. Sarah did not hesitate. Her fingers flew across the illuminated keyboard with practiced precision, launching a series of aggressive decryption protocols designed to bypass the standard executive firewalls. The large monitor on the conference table shifted to a stark black terminal screen, strings of green code scrolling rapidly as the software battered against my son's private corporate inbox. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Michael walked over to the mahogany sideboard and poured himself a glass of water, his posture rigid with tension. We were standing on the precipice of a monumental betrayal, and the air in my office felt thick enough to cut with a knife. While we waited for the encryption sequence to break, Michael turned his attention back to the initial financial dossier Sarah had compiled on the Kensington family. He wanted to understand exactly how a seasoned logistics vice president had been manipulated so completely. The deeper we looked into Tiffany Kensington and her family, the more the illusion of their elite Chicago status dissolved into a repulsive, calculated scam. Tiffany was not just a naive socialite caught up in her father's gambling addiction. She was the architect of her family's survival, a highly skilled grifter who had deliberately targeted my son. Sarah pulled up Tiffany's personal financial history, broadcasting the documents onto the secondary monitor. She had 3 separate identities registered across 4 different states, leaving a trail of maxed-out credit lines, evicted luxury apartments, and defaulted personal loans. She had infiltrated the high-society charity circuits in Chicago by leasing designer gowns and renting premium vehicles, projecting an image of untouchable wealth while actively hunting for a vulnerable, wealthy mark. Bradley, with his desperate need to feel superior, and his massive corporate trust fund, was the perfect gullible target. She had completely consumed his life, isolating him from our established family friends and filling his ear with grandiose delusions of joining the absolute upper echelon of the political elite. The $250,000 invoice for Kensington Royal Events was not just a desperate cash grab. Sarah traced the corporate registration of the fake event planning company directly to Tiffany's older brother, a man with a documented criminal history of wire fraud and petty extortion. They had orchestrated the entire wedding as a massive financial extraction operation. The loan sharks holding her father's gambling debt had explicitly threatened physical violence, giving the family a strict 30-day deadline. Bradley was so thoroughly blinded by his desire to play the wealthy savior for his elite bride that he was willing to steal from his own father to pay off an underground syndicate. But as deeply disturbing as the extortion plot was, it was still just the superficial layer of this nightmare. The true horror was waiting in the shadows of my son's digital footprint. A sharp electronic beep echoed through the office. The black terminal screen flashed violently before giving way to a clean, highly organized digital inbox. Sarah had successfully breached the encryption. We now had unrestricted access to Bradley's most heavily guarded internal communications, personal emails, and restricted financial memos. I stepped closer to the monitor, placing my hands firmly on the back of Sarah's leather chair. "Open the correspondence with the bankruptcy law firm first," I instructed, my voice maintaining a steady, emotionless cadence. "I need to know why the vice president of Caldwell Global Freight is secretly retaining insolvency specialists." Sarah clicked the search bar, filtering the inbox for any communications with Sinclair and Vance Legal Associates. A dozen email chains instantly populated the screen. She opened the most recent exchange, dated just 3 days ago. As my eyes scanned the digital text, the reality of my son's treachery began to suffocate me. Bradley was not preparing to file for personal bankruptcy to clear his mounting debts. He was actively coordinating with the lawyers to legally restructure the primary holding trusts of Caldwell Global Freight. He had submitted highly classified corporate tax returns, confidential shareholder agreements, and my personal estate planning documents to the legal team. He was asking them to prepare a series of aggressive, hostile asset transfers. The lawyers had explicitly replied that such massive transfers could only be executed if the primary shareholder, me, was deemed legally incapacitated and stripped of my executive authority. My chest tightened as I read the words. This was the second, infinitely darker layer of his plan. The wedding extortion was merely a distraction, a quick method to secure liquid cash while he maneuvered the heavy artillery into place. "Pull up the emails regarding the private medical evaluator," Michael ordered, his voice laced with a dangerous, quiet fury. He moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with me, his eyes locked on the glowing monitor. "Let us see exactly how he plans to prove you are incompetent." Sarah executed the search command. A new email chain appeared, this one exchanged with the lead physician at Elite Cognitive Assessments. The $5,000 charge on Bradley's corporate card was listed as an initial retainer for an emergency, out-of-network medical consultation. I read the email Bradley had sent to the physician. The words were a knife twisting directly into my heart. "My father, James Caldwell, has been exhibiting severe signs of advanced dementia and aggressive paranoia over the last 6 months," Bradley wrote. "His cognitive decline is rapidly becoming a catastrophic liability for our global shipping operations. He is making erratic financial decisions, forgetting major contracts, and becoming increasingly hostile toward his family. I need your team to prepare a comprehensive medical evaluation, declaring him unfit to manage his estate or his corporation. I will arrange for a mandatory evaluation immediately after my honeymoon." I stared at the screen, unable to look away from the digital manifestation of my son's profound evil. He was fabricating a medical crisis to steal my life's work. He intended to lock me away, brand me as a lunatic, and completely erase my autonomy. He was willing to strip away my human dignity just to seize control of my bank accounts and feed his toxic, parasitic fiancé. "Mr. Caldwell," said softly, her voice barely breaking the heavy silence of the room. "There is one more thing. The financial documents he provided to the bankruptcy lawyers. He could not have accessed the master holding accounts on his own. He does not have the administrative clearance for the primary trust portfolios. He had to have inside help." My mind instantly calculated the corporate hierarchy. "Cross-reference his emails with the executive accounting floor," I demanded. "Filter for secure attachments." Sarah's fingers moved rapidly. A hidden folder appeared on the screen. It contained encrypted messages sent between Bradley and Arthur Penhaligon, my chief financial officer. Arthur was actively feeding Bradley the classified financial blueprints needed to orchestrate the hostile takeover. In exchange for his absolute treason, Bradley had promised Arthur a massive corporate promotion and a significant equity stake once I was successfully removed from power. I took a slow, deep breath, stepping back from the glowing monitor. The initial shock had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. I had a wedding to crash. Michael stood beside me, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. He had spent decades defending this company against external threats, but the poison had seeped in through the executive suite. I turned away from the monitor and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. The storm outside was intensifying, but it was nothing compared to the storm I was about to unleash upon my own son. "Michael," I said, keeping my voice dangerously level, "I want Arthur Penhaligon locked out of the financial network immediately. Do not trigger the master alarm. Have your team build a shadow server. Let Arthur think he still has access, but route all his data pools into a secure, monitored sandbox. I want a complete, unbroken chain of evidence showing exactly what he attempts to steal and when he tries to send it to Bradley." Michael nodded, already tapping instructions into his phone. "Consider him contained, James. But what about the bankruptcy lawyers and the medical evaluator? If they file that fabricated dementia report, it could temporarily freeze your operational authority. Draft a preemptive strike," I instructed. "Have Sarah compile a dossier of my recent highly complex corporate maneuvers. I want sworn affidavits from the board of directors and our primary international investors attesting to my absolute unshakable mental clarity. I also want you to contact an independent court-appointed neurologist. I will submit to a full cognitive evaluation tomorrow morning. We will have pristine, irrefutable medical documentation proving my competency before Bradley even returns from his imaginary honeymoon. As for the wedding, I will handle my son personally." The next 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological compartmentalization. During the day, I attended board meetings, negotiated global shipping contracts, and projected the image of a contented, generous father who was simply giving his son space for his special weekend. At night, I sat alone in the dark expanse of my Seattle home reviewing the forensic files Sarah and her team continued to compile. Every new document was a testament to Bradley's profound greed and Tiffany's sociopathic manipulation. They had mapped out the hostile takeover with terrifying precision. They had identified the exact offshore accounts where they intended to hide my liquidated assets. They had even drafted a press release announcing my sudden, tragic medical retirement. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I had ever experienced in the cutthroat world of international logistics. You expect your competitors to try and destroy you. You expect corporate spies to hunt for your vulnerabilities. You do not expect the boy you taught to ride a bicycle, the son you carried on your shoulders, to casually orchestrate your total annihilation. I found myself staring at a silver-framed photograph on my mantel. It was a picture of Bradley and me taken 10 years ago on the day he graduated from his university. He was smiling brightly, holding his diploma while I beamed with paternal pride. I realized now that the boy in the photograph was gone. Perhaps he had never truly existed. I had indulged him, protected him from consequence, and handed him a life of extreme privilege. In doing so, I had inadvertently cultivated a monster who viewed my love as a weakness to be exploited. Friday morning arrived with a crisp, clear sky. I boarded my private jet at Boeing Field, leaving the Seattle rain behind. The flight to Chicago was quiet. I declined the flight attendant's offer of coffee or breakfast, my stomach twisted into a tight knot of anticipation and sorrow. I was flying to my only child's wedding, not to celebrate his union, but to dismantle his entire life. When the jet touched down at Midway International Airport, a black town car was waiting on the tarmac. I handed the driver an address, settled into the leather seat, and watched the city skyline approach. The Ritz-Carlton stood as a towering monument to luxury and excess. It was exactly the kind of venue Tiffany Kensington would demand to validate her fabricated high society persona. I instructed my driver to park near the secondary executive entrance. I did not enter through the grand lobby. Instead, I bypassed the standard guest channels entirely. My Platinum 5 IP status granted me access to the private management corridors. I rode the service elevator directly to the executive administrative floor and walked straight into the office of Sarah, the event coordinator I had spoken to days earlier. She looked up from her desk, her eyes widening in surprise as she recognized me. "Mr. Caldwell," she stammered, standing up quickly. "I did not expect to see you here today. You mentioned you were remaining in Seattle. Plans change." Sarah, I replied smoothly, offering a polite, disarming smile. I decided to surprise the happy couple after all. However, I want to ensure my arrival does not disrupt the carefully planned schedule. Could you please direct me to the specific ballroom they have reserved? Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second, her professional training battling with the awkward reality of the situation. Of course, sir, she said, gesturing toward the door. They are in the Magnolia Room on the second floor. They are currently doing a final walkthrough of the floral arrangements before the guests arrive for the pre-ceremony cocktail hour. I thanked her and made my way to the sweeping grand staircase. The hotel was buzzing with quiet, elegant activity, but my focus was entirely singular. I descended to the second floor, my footsteps muffled by the thick, ornate carpets. The Magnolia Room was situated at the end of a long, softly lit corridor. It was a beautiful, intimate space, but it was certainly not the massive, sprawling grand ballroom Bradley had described when he attempted to justify his phantom security costs. There were no VIP security guards stationed at the doors. There were no velvet ropes. There was only a simple wooden placard bearing the names of the bride and groom. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped into the room. The space was tastefully decorated with simple, elegant floral centerpieces, a far cry from the exotic custom installations they had invoiced me for. The room was mostly empty, save for a few catering staff arranging glassware at the bar. In the center of the dance floor stood Bradley and Tiffany. They were dressed in casual designer clothing, reviewing a seating chart with intense focus. They looked completely relaxed, utterly confident in their deception, believing they had successfully outsmarted the clueless old man. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply watching them. I watched Tiffany point to a table arrangement and laugh, the sound grating against my nerves. I watched my son nod in agreement, his posture relaxed, his arrogant smirk fully intact. They were celebrating their impending victory. They were reveling in the brilliant success of their extortion plot. They had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath their feet had already collapsed. "Hello, Bradley," I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried perfectly across the empty ballroom, slicing through the quiet chatter like a sharpened blade. Bradley froze instantly, his shoulders stiffening as if he had been struck by lightning. Tiffany gasped, dropping the clipboard she was holding. It clattered loudly against the polished hardwood floor. They both spun around to face me, their expressions transforming from relaxed confidence to absolute unfiltered horror in a matter of seconds. Dad Bradley stammered, the color rapidly draining from his face until he looked practically translucent. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be in Seattle. You said you were staying in Seattle." I slowly walked toward them, my footsteps echoing rhythmically in the silent room. I kept my hands casually in my pockets, projecting an aura of complete, unshakable control. "I know what I said, Bradley," I replied, my tone conversational, almost pleasant. "But as I sat in my office reviewing your incredibly detailed invoice, I realized it would be a profound tragedy for me to miss such a monumental occasion. After all, $250,000 buys a tremendous amount of high society entertainment. I simply had to see these state senators and bank board members for myself." Tiffany took a step back, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the fabric of her expensive designer blouse. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, her voice completely stripped of that sickeningly sweet fake warmth she had used on the phone. "This is a highly restricted event. We specifically asked for privacy. This is incredibly inappropriate." I stopped 10 feet away from them and letting my gaze drift slowly over the simple centerpieces and the modest room. I ignored Tiffany entirely, keeping my eyes locked onto my son. "It is a beautiful room, Bradley," I noted calmly. "The Magnolia Room. Classic choice. However, I must admit, I am a bit disappointed. I do not see the massive VIP security detail you mentioned. You lied completely. I had a wedding to crash." But before I could turn away from the conference table, Sarah held up her hand, her eyes locked onto a newly decrypted cluster of hidden messages. Her face had gone completely pale, illuminated by the harsh glow of the monitor. "There is more, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice dropping to a grave whisper. You need to read this specific thread before you leave. It is the final piece of the medical evaluation plan. I stepped back to the screen, leaning over her shoulder to read the digital text. It was an email exchange between Bradley and his retained bankruptcy attorneys detailing the exact timeline of their hostile takeover. The $5,000 medical evaluation was not just a preliminary step. The lawyers had already drafted a comprehensive medical power of attorney document. The plan was terrifyingly precise. Bradley intended to return from his luxurious honeymoon, quietly present the fabricated dementia diagnosis to a corrupt judge he had identified in the circuit court, and activate the medical power of attorney immediately. Within 48 hours of his return, he would have complete uncontested legal authority over my health care, my personal finances, and my entire corporate portfolio. He had explicitly instructed the attorneys to prepare the legal framework to move me into a highly restrictive, locked memory care facility in a remote part of the state, ensuring I would have absolutely no access to telephones, outside visitors, or independent legal counsel. I would be completely erased from society, a prisoner of my own son and his insatiable greed. Michael leaned over the table, reading the emails with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "This is a masterclass in premeditated elder abuse, James," he stated coldly. "They are not just trying to steal your money. They are trying to steal your basic human rights. If this medical power of attorney is activated, you will cease to exist as an autonomous individual in the eyes of the law." The sheer scale of the malice was difficult to process. I had spent my entire adult life building a global empire, negotiating with ruthless shipping magnates and international port authorities, yet I had never encountered a predator quite as cold and calculating as my own flesh and blood. I looked at the next set of decrypted files, and the final, most devastating truth began to unfold. Sarah opened a modified guest list for the wedding reception, cross-referencing it with Bradley's recent outgoing emails. The narrative Tiffany had spun about state senators and high society diplomats feeling uncomfortable around my blue-collar roots was an absolute lie. It was a carefully crafted excuse designed to keep me as far away from the Ritz-Carlton as possible. I was not banned because my presence would clash with the floral arrangements or the aesthetic of the room. I was banned because Bradley was using his wedding reception as a massive high-stakes corporate pitch meeting. Sarah highlighted 3 specific names on the guest list. I recognized them instantly. They were cutthroat venture capitalists from a notorious private equity firm in New York, men known for aggressively dismantling legacy corporations, stripping their assets, and selling the remnants to the highest bidder. I had spent the last decade explicitly blocking these exact men from gaining even a fraction of a % of equity in Caldwell Global Freight. Now they were sitting at the head tables of my son and his wedding reception. "Look at the prospectus he sent them last week," Sarah said, opening a highly classified, heavily redacted financial document Bradley had stolen from our master servers. My eyes scanned the digital pages, the betrayal burning through my veins like acid. Bradley was not just planning to take over the company. He was actively brokering a deal to sell off my 70% controlling stake to these venture capitalists. In the emails accompanying the prospectus, Bradley had painted a tragic, completely fabricated picture of my mental state. He explicitly told the investors that his father was rapidly losing his mind, that I was stepping down from the company immediately following the wedding, and that he would be assuming full executive control with the legal authority to liquidate the primary shares. He was offering them my entire empire at a heavily discounted rate, promising them an immediate hostile acquisition the moment his medical power of attorney was activated. The $250,000 extortion plot to pay off the gambling debt of the father of Tiffany was nothing compared to this. Bradley was planning to hand over a multi-billion-dollar global logistics network to corporate vultures, completely dismantling the legacy I had built from nothing. The breathtaking audacity of the scheme left the room in a heavy, stunned silence. My son had invited the very men who wanted to destroy my life and my work to drink my champagne and celebrate his fake marriage, all while conspiring to lock me in a psychiatric ward. Michael straightened his posture, snapping his laptop shut with a sharp, decisive click. James, we have enough forensic evidence right here to execute a corporate lockout and hand this directly to the federal authorities. We can have Bradley and Tiffany arrested for wire fraud and conspiracy before they even cut the wedding cake. We can freeze every single account associated with that Nevada shell company and dispatch a legal injunction to those venture capitalists warning them of the fraudulent sale. I stared at the black terminal screen processing the incredible volume of evidence we had just unearthed. The logical corporate response was to let Michael unleash the lawyers. But this was no longer just a corporate dispute. This was an intimate, catastrophic betrayal that required a much more personal resolution. Handing this over to the federal authorities would be clean and efficient, but it would not allow me to look my son in the eye and watch his entire world crumble. No, Michael, I said, my voice steady and resolute. Do not call the authorities yet. If we arrest him now, he will play the victim. He will spin a narrative that I am a paranoid, controlling father who overreacted to a simple business dispute. He needs to face the reality of his actions in front of the very audience he assembled to witness his triumph. He needs to be unmasked in front of the venture capitalists he lied to and the elite society he is trying to buy his way into. Michael nodded slowly, understanding the deep personal necessity of my decision. What do you need me to do, James? I need you to prepare the termination documents I instructed my mind, moving with cold, calculated precision. Draft an immediate, irrevocable termination of employment for the Vice President of Operations. Draft a second set of documents terminating the employment of Arthur Penhaligon, our Chief Financial Officer, effective immediately. Then I want you to draw up the legal paperwork formally removing Bradley as the primary beneficiary of my estate and the executor of my trusts. Bring the corporate seals and the notarized affidavits of my medical competency. You are coming with me to the Ritz-Carlton. We are going to hand-deliver these documents to my son personally, Sarah. I continued, turning to the brilliant investigator who had exposed the entire fraudulent operation. I want you to print hard copies of every single piece of evidence you found today. Print the emails to the bankruptcy lawyers, the correspondence with the medical evaluator, the fake wedding invoices, and the background checks on the underground gambling debts. Bind them in a secure presentation folder. If Bradley attempts to deny any of this, I want the irrefutable proof ready to be placed directly into his hands. The team moved into immediate action, the conference room transforming into a staging ground for the impending confrontation. I walked back to my desk and picked up the velvet-lined invoice one last time. The gold-foiled letters of Kensington Royal Events seemed to mock me, a glaring symbol of the lies and manipulation that had infiltrated my family. I folded the heavy cardstock in half and placed it into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. Within 20 minutes, Michael handed me a thick black leather portfolio containing the legally binding termination documents, the estate revisions, and the comprehensive forensic evidence Sarah had compiled. I tucked the portfolio under my arm, the weight of the paper feeling substantial and necessary. It was the physical manifestation of my life, my authority, and my unyielding resolve to protect what I had built. We left the office and headed directly to the cold underground parking garage. My driver was waiting by the car. We sped toward the airport in total silence. The grief had completely vanished. I was no longer the loving father trying to appease an ungrateful child. I strapped securely into the jet seat. I knew the flight to Chicago would quickly bring a very painful, permanent reckoning for them. The private jet cut through the night sky, carrying me closer to the epicenter of my son's ultimate betrayal. I did not sleep during the 4-hour flight to Chicago. I sat in the dimly lit cabin with Michael Thorne, meticulously outlining the immediate and absolute destruction of Arthur Penhaligon. It was 2 o'clock in the morning in Seattle when I initiated the secure corporate video conference from the sky. Arthur answered with the groggy, confused demeanor of a man who thought he was entirely untouchable. He was sitting in his home office, wearing a silk robe, likely expecting a late-night directive regarding Asian shipping routes or a minor logistical delay. Instead, he found himself staring at me through the monitor with Michael and our lead corporate security director standing silently in the background. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply shared my screen and presented the decrypted emails, the offshore transaction logs, and the explicit proof of his conspiracy with Bradley to fabricate my medical records and orchestrate a hostile takeover. I watched the blood rapidly drain from his face as the reality of his situation set in. He tried to stammer out an excuse claiming his account had been hacked, but I silenced him immediately. I offered him a singular, non-negotiable choice. He could sign the digitally transmitted confession and immediate letter of resignation, surrendering all his equity and stock options, or my security director would immediately contact the federal authorities waiting outside his front door. The choice was his. He signed the document with a trembling digital pen. The moment the signature registered in our system, his access to the Caldwell Global Freight Network was permanently severed. He was escorted out of his own home by our private security team in the middle of the night. With the traitorous chief financial officer completely neutralized, I turned my attention to my son. I authorized Michael to execute the total financial freeze. I watched the live dashboard on my monitor as Bradley's corporate credit cards were instantly deactivated. We froze his primary checking accounts. We placed an impenetrable legal lock on the massive trust fund I had established for him when he was just a child. We reversed his authorized access to the corporate vehicle fleet and canceled his executive health insurance policies. In a matter of seconds, the wealthy, powerful vice president of operations was reduced to a man who could not even afford a cup of coffee. The guillotine had fallen smoothly and silently. When the jet touched down at Midway International Airport, the morning sun was just beginning to break over the horizon, casting a cold, gray light across the tarmac. I proceeded to my reserved suite at the downtown Peninsula Hotel. I laid out my custom-tailored black suit, the fabric perfectly pressed, dark, and unforgiving. I showered, fastened my watch, adjusted my tie, and reached into my leather travel bag to retrieve a small, silver-framed photograph I always carried with me. It was a picture of my late wife, Diane. Her warm, beautiful smile seemed to contrast sharply with the absolute coldness that had settled inside my chest. She had loved Bradley with a fierce, blinding devotion. She had always believed he would grow into a man of honor and unparalleled integrity. I stared into her eyes, feeling the profound, crushing weight of my failure as a father. "I am sorry, Diane," I whispered to the empty, quiet room, my voice rough with unshed tears. "But I have to destroy him." The Blacktown car glided through the bustling Chicago streets, arriving at the grand entrance of the Ritz-Carlton. The facade of the building gleamed with elite prestige, the exact kind of superficial luxury Tiffany and her family craved to mask their severe financial ruin. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked through the main lobby, bypassing the concierge desk and heading straight for the sweeping grand staircase that led to the primary ballrooms. Bradley had clearly pulled together enough stolen funds to secure the space masking his extortion plot with expensive flowers and grand orchestras. But his reign was about to violently end. As I approached the intricately carved mahogany doors of the grand ballroom, two large, imposing men in dark suits stepped into my path. They were private security likely hired with the very money Bradley had embezzled from my company. "I am sorry, sir," the taller of the two stated, crossing his massive arms and blocking the entrance. "This is a private exclusive event. Your name is not on the cleared guest list." I did not argue with the hired muscle. I simply pulled out my phone and dialed the direct line for the hotel general manager, David Sterling. 10 years ago, when David was managing a struggling boutique property in Seattle, a massive logistical error nearly bankrupted his entire operation. I had personally absorbed the shipping costs, saving his career and allowing him to ascend to his current prestigious position. He owed me a debt of loyalty that money could not buy. David answered immediately. I told him exactly where I was and what was happening. Less than 60 seconds later, his voice crackled through the security guard's earpiece. The guard's expression shifted from aggressive authority to sheer, unadulterated panic. He stepped aside immediately, bowing his head in submission and reaching out to pull the heavy handle I pushed the heavy mahogany doors open, the sound completely drowned out by the elegant string quartet playing in the corner of the lavish room. The reception was in full swing, a sea of crystal silk and expensive champagne. Laughter echoed across the high ceilings, and waiters glided through the crowd, carrying silver trays of decadent appetizers. And there, standing right in the center of the room, was my son. The reason I was banned from this wedding was not because of my blue-collar background. It was not because my presence would embarrass Tiffany in front of state senators. It was because Bradley was using his own wedding reception as a massive high-stakes corporate pitch meeting. Bradley was holding a crystal flute surrounded by 3 older men in impeccably tailored suits. I recognized them instantly from the forensic dossier Michael had prepared. They were the cutthroat venture capitalists from New York, the corporate vultures who had spent years trying to sink their claws into my shipping empire. Bradley was actively schmoozing them. His posture relaxed and arrogant, a wide, confident smile plastered across his face. He raised his glass to the investors, his voice carrying clearly over the gentle music. He was assuring them that the transition of power would be entirely seamless. He promised the venture capitalists that the old man was rapidly losing his mind and gracefully stepping down, and that Caldwell Global Freight would soon be theirs to dissect, restructure, and monetize. He was selling my life's work to the highest bidder to cover his tracks. I walked slowly and deliberately onto the dance floor. My custom black suit cut through the sea of pastel dresses and gray tuxedos like a dark shadow. The guests nearest the door began to fall silent, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The silence spread through the room like a rolling wave until the only sound left was the string quartet, which eventually faltered and faded away. I stopped just a few feet away from his triumphant circle, waiting for him to notice the ghost he thought he had successfully buried. Bradley lowered his crystal champagne flute slowly, the sparkling golden liquid tilting dangerously close to the rim. The confident, arrogant smile melted from his face, replaced by a pale mask of absolute terror. He blinked rapidly, as if hoping the image of his father standing before him was merely a stress-induced hallucination. The 3 venture capitalists from New York turned their attention toward me, their brows furrowing in unison. They recognized me, of course. I had personally thrown 2 of them out of my corporate boardroom just 3 years prior. They looked from me to Bradley, sensing the immediate collapse of the narrative they had just been sold. Dad Bradley managed to say, his voice a breathless rasp that barely carried over the dead silence of the ballroom. "What are you doing here? You need to rest." Even now, standing on the edge of the abyss, he was desperately attempting to signal to the investors that I was a confused old man who wandered out of care. I spoke with the booming, resonant authority that had commanded international shipping fleets for decades. "I am in perfect health, Bradley," I stated clearly. "In fact, my cognitive functions are sharp enough to have uncovered the incredibly sloppy, hostile takeover you planned for the last 6 weeks." I turned my gaze directly to the 3 venture capitalists. "Gentlemen," I said, nodding to them with a humorless smile, "I understand my vice president of operations promised you a heavily discounted acquisition of Caldwell Global Freight once he assumed legal control of my estate. I am here to inform you the sale is canceled." The lead investor, a tall man named Harrison, narrowed his eyes at my son. Bradley Harrison asked, his tone dangerous. "Is he stepping down or not?" Bradley opened his mouth, a panicked gasp escaping his throat, but no actual words formed. He looked wildly toward Tiffany, who was frozen beside a towering display of white roses, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of a table. She looked like a cornered animal, her fabricated high society persona crumbling instantly. "He is not stepping down, Harrison," I answered for him, "and neither is he assuming control." I unbuttoned my custom black suit jacket and pulled the thick, heavy leather portfolio from under my arm. I unzipped the binder and pulled out the first stack of documents, the crisp white paper contrasting against my dark attire. I held the papers out toward Bradley. His hands remained glued to his sides, trembling violently, so I simply dropped the documents onto the table. That is your official immediate termination of employment from Caldwell Global Freight, I announced, projecting my voice. You are stripped of your title and your corporate access. Furthermore, your primary partner, Arthur Penhaligon, was fired at 2 a.m. this morning. He signed a legally binding confession detailing your joint efforts to steal my classified financial data, forge my electronic signatures, and orchestrate a hostile transfer. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Getting caught actively defrauding a billionaire while forging corporate signatures is a career-ending plague. Harrison set his champagne glass down and walked away without a single word, his two associates following quickly behind him. Bradley watched his future vanish through the ballroom doors. He turned back to me, his eyes wide and pleading tears spilling down his pale cheeks. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic sob. "We can talk about all this privately. You are ruining my wedding." I looked at the tears streaming down his face and felt absolutely nothing. The paternal instinct to protect him had burned away completely, leaving only a cold, unyielding resolve. "You ruined your own wedding the moment you decided to steal from me to pay off a gambling debt," I said coldly, turning toward Tiffany. She flinched as my gaze locked onto her. I pulled the second stack of documents from the portfolio. These were the forensic printouts detailing the Kensington family absolute financial ruin. "You thought you were incredibly clever, Tiffany," I said. "You found a wealthy Mark desperate enough for validation to believe your ridiculous aristocratic facade. You convinced him to siphon $250,000 into a fake event planning company registered to your brother. You thought you could use my money to save your father from the Las Vegas loan sharks, currently threatening to break his legs." Her mother let out a sharp, hysterical cry from the front row of tables. Tiffany shook her head frantically, tears ruining her immaculate bridal makeup. "That is a lie," she screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "He is lying, Bradley. Tell them he is lying." I tossed the forensic documents onto the floor at her feet. The glossy photographs of the foreclosure notices on her family estate scattered across the polished hardwood. "The evidence is right there for everyone to read," I stated flatly. The bounced hotel deposit, the fake floral invoices. The entire fairy tale was a cheap, desperate grift, and my son was foolish enough to fall for it entirely. Bradley stared at the papers on the floor, his entire reality fragmenting before his eyes. He looked at Tiffany and saw the truth written clearly in her terrified, guilty expression. She had played him perfectly, pushing him to commit federal wire fraud against his own father. But he was not innocent. He was a willing, eager participant in his own absolute destruction. I pulled the final document from the portfolio. It was the heavily stamped and notarized revision of my estate planning. I held it up for him. "As of this morning," I continued, my voice echoing with finality, "you have been permanently removed as the primary beneficiary of my estate. Your massive trust fund has been legally frozen. Your corporate credit cards have been deactivated. The luxury condominium you live in is owned by a holding company I control, and you will receive a formal eviction notice immediately." Bradley dropped to his knees right there on the dance floor, his expensive gray tuxedo pants pooling around his legs. He buried his face in his hands, weeping openly, the sound echoing miserably. He had lost his job, his fortune, and his future. "Dad, I am sorry," he wailed, his words muffled by his hands. "I am so sorry. I was desperate. I was not thinking clearly. Please help me. I am your son." I looked down at the weeping, broken man. I thought about the emails he had sent to the medical evaluator, the cold, clinical way he had planned to lock me in a psychiatric ward and strip away my human dignity. He had not viewed me as a father. He viewed me as a target. "You stopped being my son the moment you decided I was disposable," I said. "You made your choices, Bradley. Good luck explaining this mess to the loan sharks." I turned my back on the ruins of their wedding. I did not look back. I pushed through the heavy mahogany doors and stepped into the quiet elegance of the hotel corridor. I walked toward the waiting car, completely ready to return safely home and rebuild. Bradley's eyes finally met mine. The arrogant, triumphant smirk dissolved so quickly, it was as if it had been wiped away by acid. His crystal champagne flute slipped from his trembling fingers, shattering against the polished hardwood floor with a sharp, violent crash that echoed through the sudden silence. The three venture capitalists turned their heads, their expressions shifting from polite interest to deep confusion as they recognized me. I did not stop walking. I moved past my son, ignoring the panicked, breathless gasp that escaped his throat. I approached the small elevated stage set up for the evening toasts. A silver microphone stood waiting on a sleek stand. The string quartet, sensing the overwhelming tension radiating through the room, let their final notes squeak to a halt. The suffocating silence of 200 expectant guests settled over the grand ballroom. I stepped onto the stage, my heavy black suit absorbing the ambient light, and gripped the cool metal of the microphone. I tapped the microphone once. The sound boomed through the state-of-the-art acoustic system, demanding absolute attention from every soul in the room. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady, carrying the low resonant timbre of a man who has spent a lifetime commanding global boardrooms. "For those of you who do not know me, my name is James Caldwell. I am Bradley's father." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. I saw Tiffany standing near the head table, her face draining of all color until she looked like a porcelain doll about to crack. Earlier this week, my son informed me that I was simply not elite enough to attend this magnificent reception. I continued, letting my gaze sweep over the sea of horrified faces. He told me that my presence, the presence of a man who built a global logistics empire from the muddy docks of Seattle, would deeply offend the delicate sensibilities of the politicians, the bankers, and the high society guests gathered here tonight. He stated that I would embarrass him. He claimed my blue-collar roots would be a stain on his perfect evening. I paused, deliberately making eye contact with the three venture capitalists who were now slowly backing away from Bradley, realizing the corporate asset they thought they were stealing was standing right in front of them, fully aware and fully in control. My son also informed me that this incredibly refined evening required a staggering $250,000 in VIP security and aesthetic upgrades, I said, my voice echoing off the chandeliers. An amount he demanded I wire immediately to a shell company in Nevada. He told me this was standard procedure for wealth management. He told me this was how high society operates. The murmurs erupted into shocked, scandalized gasps. I raised my free hand, demanding silence. The room obeyed instantly. But as the man whose corporate credit card is currently on file to hold this beautiful ballroom, I feel it is my duty to share a vital update with you all. I took a slow, measured breath, projecting my voice to the very back of the hall. I have just informed the bank that the card has been reported stolen. Furthermore, I have officially withdrawn my financial authorization for this entire event. The reaction was immediate and entirely orchestrated. David Sterling, the general manager whose career I had saved a decade ago, had briefed his staff perfectly. At the exact moment those words left my mouth, the ballroom doors swung open. A team of banquet captains marched in, signaling the waitstaff. Like a highly trained military unit, the servers immediately stopped pouring wine. They stepped back from the tables, removing the silver trays of hot appetizers and carrying them swiftly out of the room. The bartenders closed the premium liquor bottles, locked their registers, and stood shoulder to shoulder against the back wall. The lavish, opulent illusion of the Kensington family was being dismantled piece by piece in real time. Bradley stood completely paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "Dad," he finally choked out, his voice cracking loudly over the murmuring crowd. "What are you doing? You cannot do this. You are ruining everything." I looked down at him from the stage, feeling no pity, no regret, only a cold, mechanical necessity to finish what he had started. "I am not ruining anything, Bradley. I am simply refusing to finance the hostile takeover of my own life. I am refusing to pay the underground gambling debts of your fraudulent in-laws." At the mention of the gambling debts, Richard Kensington, Tiffany's father, lunged forward from his seat. His face was a dark, mottled purple, sweating profusely in his rented tuxedo. "How dare you!" Richard bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at the stage. "You are slandering my family. I will sue you for every penny you are worth." Before I could respond, David Sterling stepped onto the dance floor, flanked by two large hotel security officers. He walked directly up to Richard and Bradley, holding a crisp white invoice in his hand. "Gentlemen," David said, his professional voice projecting clearly into the silent, tense room. "Since Mr. Caldwell has officially revoked his financial backing, the outstanding balance for the ballroom rental, the catering staff, and the current consumption must be settled immediately. The total is $35,000. As the original deposit was returned due to insufficient funds, we require a new valid form of payment right now. Otherwise, I must ask everyone to vacate the premises." Richard Kensington stared at the piece of paper as if it were a venomous snake. He patted his pockets, his false bravado evaporating into pure, unadulterated terror. He did not have $35,000. He barely had the money to rent his suit. He looked frantically at the guests, but the elite society he had spent years trying to con were already turning their backs, whispering in absolute disgust. The venture capitalists were already walking toward the exit, their phones glued to their ears, scrambling to distance themselves from the radioactive disaster unfolding before them. Tiffany let out a piercing, hysterical sob, grabbing Bradley by the lapels of his jacket. "Pay them, Bradley," she shrieked, her manicured nails digging into his chest. "Use your corporate accounts. Wire the money right now. Do something. We cannot be humiliated like this in front of everyone." Bradley looked down at her, his eyes wide and hollow. The arrogant corporate shark had completely vanished, replaced by a terrified, broken boy who had finally realized the true cost of his betrayal. He looked back up at me, standing on the stage, untouchable and resolute. "I cannot," he whispered miserably, the absolute reality of his destruction finally crashing down upon him. "He fired Arthur. He froze all my accounts. He froze my trust fund. I have absolutely nothing." The silence that followed his confession was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The room watched as the Golden Prince of Caldwell Global Freight admitted his total ruin. The grand illusion was completely shattered. I set the microphone down gently on the stand. I turned away quietly. Bradley lunged toward me, his face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate rage. He gripped my arm, his fingers digging into the fabric of my suit, his breath coming in ragged, uneven gasps. "Get off this stage," he hissed, his voice barely audible over the low murmur of the crowd. "You are insane and nobody here is listening to your pathetic lies." I did not flinch. I did not move. I looked down at his hand, gripping my arm with a calm, almost clinical detachment. I simply raised my other hand and gestured toward the three venture capitalists who were now huddled together, watching the drama unfold with stone-cold professional interest. "Before you make an even larger fool of yourself, Bradley, I suggest you take your hands off me," I said, my voice cutting through the ballroom with the weight of absolute authority. "I am sure these gentlemen would be very interested to read the documents I have prepared for them." I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the crisp, legally binding confession, signed by Arthur Penhaligon. It was a masterpiece of corporate accountability, detailing every fraudulent entry, every forged signature, and every illicit offshore transfer Bradley had authorized to cover his tracks. I held it out toward Harrison, the lead investor. He hesitated for only a second, before snatching it from my hand, his eyes scanning the lines with rapid, predatory precision. As Harrison read, the color drained from his face. He leaned over to share the paper with his two partners. They did not need more than a few seconds. Their expressions shifted from confusion to cold, professional disdain. They looked at Bradley, who was still clutching my arm as if they were looking at a common thief caught in a basement. Harrison folded the paper neatly, placed it back into the folder, and looked at me with a nod of cold respect. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear, "we have no interest in any entity associated with fraudulent financial reporting. Please consider our offer of acquisition permanently withdrawn." He turned on his heel, his partners trailing behind him like shadows. They did not even glance at Bradley as they walked toward the exit, their departure signaling the total death of my son's corporate aspirations. Bradley released my arm as if I had burned him. He stumbled back, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an ally, a loophole, any sign of the life he thought he had secured. There was nothing. Just 200 guests watching the absolute disintegration of a legacy he had tried to sell for scrap. The ballroom doors opened again, but this time the atmosphere shifted from awkward tension to sharp clinical urgency. Michael Thorne walked through the entrance, his pace steady and purposeful. He was not alone. 2 uniformed Chicago police officers walked at his side, their presence commanding an immediate, chilling hush. They did not look at the guests. They did not look at me. They walked with singular purpose directly toward a table in the corner, where a man in an expensive but ill-fitting tuxedo was drinking a glass of scotch. It was Tiffany's brother, the architect of the fake event planning company. He looked up, his eyes widening as he recognized the badges. He scrambled to stand, knocking his chair backward, but he was far too late. The officers reached him in 3 long strides. "You are under arrest for wire fraud and conspiracy to commit extortion," one of the officers announced, his voice booming. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed against the marble walls like a gavel striking a bench. Tiffany let out a long, drawn-out scream that bordered on physical pain. She ran toward her brother, but the security team stepped in, creating an impenetrable wall between the bride and her failing scheme. Bradley stood paralyzed, his eyes fixed on the spectacle, the realization finally dawning on him that his entire house of cards had not just collapsed, it was being incinerated. I remained on the stage, the microphone still in my hand. I watched the police lead the man out, the guests parting like the Red Sea to let them pass. The wedding was no longer a celebration of union. It was a public execution of a fraud. "Is there anyone else here," I asked, my voice smooth and calm, "who would like to discuss the financial structure of Kensington Royal Events?" The silence was the only response. No one dared to breathe. No one dared to speak. The room felt suddenly very cold, the opulence of the ballroom now feeling like a hollow plastic set. I stepped down from the stage, walking directly toward my son. He looked smaller than he ever had, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the floor. I stopped directly in front of him, the distance between us closing, until I could smell the expensive, nervous sweat of his defeat. "You really thought you could play the game better than the master, Bradley?" I said, my voice a quiet, dangerous whisper. "You thought that because I was your father, I was weak. You thought that because I loved you, I was blind. You were mistaken on every single account." I reached into my pocket and took out a final document. It was the formal, irrevocable notification of his immediate and permanent exile from the Caldwell name and all associated family trusts. I tucked the paper into the breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket. "You have 30 minutes to leave this hotel," I said. "If I see you or her anywhere near my properties or my offices after that, the next time you see me, it will be through a plexiglass partition in a federal courtroom." I did not wait for a response. I turned and walked toward the exit, the heavy doors of the ballroom feeling lighter than air. I had done what I came to do. The fire was lit, the house was burning, and my conscience, for the first time in months, was absolutely clear. I walked out into the cool Chicago night, ready to start the long, necessary process of rebuilding a life that was finally truly my own. I did not care about the money. I did not care about the status. I only cared about the silence that followed me as I disappeared into the dark. I was a man who had been pushed, and for once the push had finally shattered the wrong person. The game was over, and I was the one standing on the pedestal. I reached my car, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself a genuine cold smile of satisfaction. The weight of the world was gone, replaced by the clean, sharp blade of reality. I felt nothing but the hum of the engine and the promise of a quiet, controlled future. Everything was in its place. The architect of the pain was removed, the trash was taken out, and my legacy was safe. I was finally, at long last, in complete control again. The air in the city felt different, sharper, cleaner. I was home even in a city I barely knew. I was the master of my own domain. It was perfect. I looked at the dark windows of the Ritz-Carlton one last time, turned the ignition, and drove into the night. The silence in the grand ballroom was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical weight thick with the scent of lilies and ruined ambition. Bradley remained on his knees, his hands trembling, as he stared at the floor, while Tiffany stood over him, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. The fake sweetness that had defined her for months vanished, exposing the hollow, desperate parasite underneath. She did not reach out to comfort him. She did not offer a hand to help him stand. Instead, she leaned down, her voice a sharp, jagged blade that cut through the quiet room. "You pathetic, useless fool," she hissed, the words echoing against the vaulted ceiling. "I gave you everything. I built a life for you out of nothing, and you could not even handle your own father. You promised me the executive seat. You promised me the trust funds and the controlling interest. Now I am standing here in a dress I cannot afford, surrounded by people who know exactly what you are. You are a broke, insignificant loser." Bradley flinched at every syllable, his shoulders hunching, as if he were trying to shrink away from her wrath. He looked up at her, his eyes wild and bloodshot, desperate to shift the burden of his failure. "It was your idea, Tiffany," he stammered, the cowardice in his voice revolting. "You were the one who pushed for the medical evaluator. You were the one who drafted the timeline for the asset transfers. You said we had to move quickly before he suspected anything. I was just doing it for us, for our future." She laughed, then a sharp, jarring sound that lacked any trace of humor. "Our future. There is no future, Bradley. I only saw a bridge to my own survival, and you were the most gullible, predictable piece of architecture I have ever encountered. You were never a partner. You were just a desperate child playing dress-up in a billionaire suit." I watched the scene unfold with a cold, detached clarity. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and withdrew the folded gold-foiled invoice from Kensington Royal Events. I held it for a moment, the heavy paper cool against my palm, before letting it drift from my fingers. It tumbled through the air and landed with a soft thud directly onto the polished surface of Bradley's pristine, expensive tuxedo shoes. The gold lettering caught the light, a gaudy monument to the $250,000 he had stolen to pay for a life he had never actually possessed. "You told me once, Bradley," I said, my voice cutting through their pathetic squabbling with absolute finality, "that I should be grateful you allowed me to contribute to your life. You told me I should be honored to have a place in your elite world." I looked down at him, my expression devoid of the warmth I had wasted on him for 30 years. "So be thankful, Bradley. Be incredibly thankful that I showed up tonight to relieve you of the burden of my fortune. You no longer have to pretend to be the heir to an empire you were too weak and too greedy to protect." Bradley looked at the invoice on his feet, and then back up at me, his mouth agape. The color of his face was a ghostly, sickly gray. He reached out as if to touch my leg, to beg one last time, but he pulled his hand back as he saw the absolute lack of mercy in my eyes. I turned my back on them, my movements slow and deliberate. I did not look back at the room, at the guests who were now whispering and scrambling for the exits, or at the shattered couple cowering in the center of the dance floor. I pushed through the mahogany doors, the heavy weight of the building's opulence falling away behind me. The hallway was empty, the hotel staff keeping a respectful distance as I passed. I walked with a steady, rhythmic stride, the cold air of the lobby welcoming me like an old friend. My driver was waiting by the curb, the engine of the town car idling with a soft, confident hum. I slipped into the back seat, the quiet luxury of the interior shielding me from the chaotic, crumbling world I had just left behind. As the car pulled away from the Ritz-Carlton, I allowed myself to exhale. I pulled out my phone and checked the status of the corporate accounts. Every single alert showed the successful, absolute isolation of my son's financial life. There were no more leaks, no more secret data pulls, and no more unauthorized access. The surgical precision with which I had removed him from my existence felt not like a tragedy, but like a healing. I had spent years worrying about his potential, about his character, and about his place in the world. I had been burdened by a phantom image of a son who never truly existed, an illusion crafted by my own hope and the carefully curated lies of those who surrounded him. I thought of the many years ahead. They would be different, certainly, but they would be entirely on my terms. I would restructure the executive team, I would mentor the younger, hungrier managers who had actually earned their positions through grit and talent, and I would continue to grow the logistics network I had sweat to build. I would not allow Bradley's failure to color my perception of the people who were actually loyal to the company. My legacy was secure, my health was documented and verified, and my autonomy was restored. I was no longer a target to be managed by a medical evaluator. I was a man in the full strength of his capability, reclaimed from the parasites who had tried to feed on my life's work. The driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his eyes briefly meeting mine. "Are we heading to the airport, sir?" he asked, his voice soft and respectful. "Yes," I said, leaning my head back against the soft leather. "Home. I have no more business in Chicago." The city lights blurred as we picked up speed, the towering buildings fading into the distance. I watched the skyline disappear, feeling a profound sense of lightness. I had done what needed to be done. I had held the mirror up to the lies, and I had watched the reflection shatter. There was no regret, only the cold, hard satisfaction of a problem solved and a future secured. I closed my eyes, the gentle motion of the car lulling me into a rare, deep peace. The storm was over, and for the first time in a very long time, I was the only person in control of my own destiny. The journey ahead would be long, and the process of corporate reconstruction would be intense, but I had the tools, the resolve, and the clarity to see it through. My son was now a chapter that had been firmly closed, a lesson in the dangers of unearned privilege and the blindness of paternal love. I would not make that mistake again. The road back to Seattle was long, but it was clear, and it was entirely my own. The world was quiet again, and that was exactly how I wanted it to be. I was finally, truly free. The courtroom was sterile, smelling faintly of floor wax and old paper, a stark contrast to the opulence of the Ritz-Carlton, where this nightmare had begun. I sat in the front row of the gallery, my spine straight, my gaze fixed on the mahogany bench. Beside me, Michael Thorne checked his watch with rhythmic precision, his presence a quiet anchor in the unfolding chaos. Across the aisle, the reality of my son's descent was on full display. Bradley was seated at the defendant's table wearing a drab, ill-fitting charcoal suit that hung loosely on his frame. He looked older, gaunt, his eyes darting toward the gallery, with a desperate, frantic energy that I had never seen before. It had been 1 month since that night in the ballroom. The fallout had been swift and brutal. The federal indictment for embezzlement had arrived 2 weeks after the failed reception, a comprehensive document detailing every cent he had siphoned from the corporate logistics fund. Beside him sat a court-appointed public defender. A woman who looked as tired as Bradley appeared broken. Tiffany Kensington was nowhere to be seen. Her legal counsel had filed for an annulment within 72 hours of the event, her transition from doting fiancé to stranger executed with the same predatory speed that had characterized her infiltration of my family. She had realized instantly that the well was dry and the Caldwell name was now a liability rather than a ticket to comfort. Her father Richard had finally lost the family estate to foreclosure, the final humiliating chapter of their long, desperate scam. As the judge took his seat, the room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The prosecutor stood to outline the charges, her voice devoid of emotion, as she detailed the systematic theft. I watched Bradley's hands, which were clenched so tightly under the table that his knuckles were white. He was no longer the arrogant vice president projecting power. He was a man staring directly into the abyss of a 12-year sentence. He glanced at me, once his eyes wet and pleading, seeking the same fatherly leniency he had relied upon for his entire life. I did not blink. I did not look away. I allowed him to see the complete icy emptiness where his father's affection used to reside. There would be no bailouts, no secret settlements, no quiet intervention. The proceedings moved forward with clinical detachment. When the judge asked for a statement, Bradley's voice was a barely audible rasp. He attempted to articulate some semblance of regret, but it came off as a hollow performance lacking any grounding in true character. I saw the judge's expression harden. It was the same look I had seen on dozens of faces in the business world when a bad deal was finally laid bare. There was no room for performance art in a federal court. I turned my attention back to the folder in my lap, which contained the final set of documents drafted by my legal team. During the recess, I motioned for my estate attorney to join us. The paperwork for the irrevocable removal of Bradley from all family assets was already prepared and awaiting a single final signature. I pulled the documents out, the heavy official paper smooth against my fingertips. I was not just removing him from the will. I was effectively deleting the financial future he had assumed was his birthright. Every stock share, every trust, every minor asset that had been earmarked for him over the years was being liquidated and redirected into a corporate educational fund for underprivileged students pursuing careers in global logistics. It was the ultimate poetic reversal. The resources he had tried to weaponize to destroy my company would now serve to build the very talent pool he had ignored in his quest for easy wealth. I signed each page with a firm, unwavering hand. There was no shaking, no hesitation, and certainly no doubt. For decades, I had been the architect of his comfort, protecting him from the harsh edges of reality. I realized now that the most profound harm I had done was shielding him from the very consequences that might have taught him to be a better man. By the time he walked out of that courtroom, he would be a private citizen in every sense of the word, entirely responsible for his own survival. The tumor had been excised, the infection cleaned, and the family tree finally stripped of its rot. The afternoon session began, and the prosecutor shifted her focus to the broader implications of his fraud. The judge, an older man with a reputation for being exceptionally strict regarding white-collar crime, took copious notes, his jaw set in a line of grim judgment. I looked at Bradley one last time before I stood up to leave. He was looking at the back of the courtroom, perhaps searching for Tiffany, perhaps just staring into the nothingness of his own making. I walked out of the courtroom, the heavy doors closing behind me with a final definitive thud. Outside, the Chicago air was bracing, carrying the sharp scent of the lake. I drew in a long, cleansing breath. The city felt different to me now, stripped of the deceit that had previously blinded me to the truth. I had achieved the absolute clarity I had sought, and while it came at the cost of my only child, it was a price I was willing to pay. I stepped into the waiting car, the interior quiet and warm. "I don't need to stay for the sentencing, James," Michael said, his voice respectful and low. "I have the transcripts, and the final verdict will be logged electronically. You are free to go." I nodded, feeling a profound sense of closure settle over me. I turned to Michael, my gaze lingering on the window as the city began to zip past. The legal side of this, the freezing of his assets and the formal disinheritance, was the easy part. The real work began now, rebuilding the trust of my investors and re-establishing the standard of integrity I had always promised. I was prepared for the challenge. Yet I picked up my phone and opened the app that displayed the internal network of the firm. I looked at the dashboard for a long time. The numbers were recovering, the volatility had smoothed out, and the infrastructure was stronger than it had been in years. I checked the status of the new scholarship fund. It was already being populated with the redirected funds from Bradley's frozen trust. It was an investment that would yield dividends in human potential rather than mere profit. It was exactly what Diane would have wanted. She had always seen the potential for good in everyone. And if she could not see it in our son, she would certainly support the redirection of that legacy toward those who had to fight for every inch of their progress. My driver accelerated, merging smoothly onto the highway. The ride back to the airport was silent, but it was a comfortable silence filled with the satisfaction of a master craftsman who had just cleared his workbench of flawed materials. I watched the sprawling Chicago suburbs melt away, feeling no desire to ever return. My life was waiting in Seattle, a life that was finally mine again, completely unencumbered by the expectations and schemes of those I had trusted. I reached into my pocket and touched the cold edge of my keys. My house, my company, my legacy, all were waiting. Everything was ordered. Everything was prepared. I had dismantled the facade, exposed the lies, and finally accepted that the man I raised was not the man I thought I knew. And in that acceptance, I found the strength to walk away. The flight back to the coast was spent in a rare state of focus. I began sketching out the framework for a new board structure, one that would insulate the company against internal greed and prioritize long-term stability over short-term growth. My mind was sharp, my intuition functioning at a level it hadn't touched in a decade. The betrayal had not weakened me. It had hardened me, clarifying my purpose and sharpening my resolve. I would not repeat the mistakes of the past. I would build a future that was impervious to the weakness of inherited privilege. I would ensure that the Caldwell name was synonymous with resilience, honesty, and hard-earned merit. As the plane began its descent over the Puget Sound, I looked down at the dark, shimmering water. I was returning to a world that was different, but it was a world where I belonged. I was finally ready to live without the weight of a ghost. I stepped off the plane into the cool, damp air of home, ready to walk into the future I had saved for myself. The office was silent, save for the low rhythmic hum of the building's climate control system. I stood before the vast expanse of floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the horizon, where the dark waters of the Puget Sound met the gray, overcast sky. Below me, the sprawling port of Seattle moved with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. Massive cargo ships bearing the signature insignia of Caldwell Global Freight were being loaded and unloaded by cranes that looked like prehistoric birds against the shoreline. My legacy, my life's work, was moving, breathing, and expanding, just as it had for the last 30 years. The storm of the last few months had been devastating, but as I looked down at the organized chaos of the docks, I felt only a profound, crystalline calm. I had successfully excised the rot. My company was no longer a vessel for internal sabotage. It was once again a fortress of integrity. I did not turn when the heavy oak door behind me opened. I did not need to see who had entered. The measured, confident cadence of the footsteps was unmistakable. Natalie. My daughter had spent the better part of a decade managing our European division with a level of brilliance and tactical insight that had often surpassed my own. She had been the quiet force, the one who remained untainted by the toxic vacuum of Bradley's ambition. While I had been blinded by the misplaced hope of a father, Natalie had been building her own reputation in London, Frankfurt, and Paris, never asking for help, never demanding a seat at the table she had earned through sheer competence. She came to a halt a few feet behind me, her presence steady. "I have reviewed the restructuring reports you sent over from Chicago, James," she said, her voice carrying the same unflinching strength that defined her character. "The board has already confirmed the termination of Bradley's shares. The venture capitalists have retreated, and the auditors are satisfied that the internal fraud was isolated and contained. The company is leaner, more resilient, and our investors are actually more confident now than they were before the scandal broke. They appreciate that you took the knife to your own family to save the firm." I finally turned to look at her. Natalie was standing there in a sharp navy-tailored suit, her dark hair pulled back with effortless elegance. She looked exactly like her mother, possessing the same sharp, observant eyes that missed nothing. I walked over to my desk and picked up the polished, heavy steel badge that had been Bradley's. It felt cold and hollow, a symbol of a role he never truly understood. I held it out to her, the metal catching the morning light that was finally beginning to penetrate the clouds. "I have spent my life building this, Natalie," I began, my voice clear and devoid of any lingering resentment. "I thought the purpose was to ensure an inheritance, to build a throne for a son who I assumed would eventually grow into it. I was wrong. The purpose was never the bloodline. The purpose was the integrity of the work itself. You have proven yourself in the most difficult markets on the continent, and you have done so without ever asking for a shortcut. I need someone who understands that the cost of betrayal is absolute, and who recognizes that our reputation is the only currency that truly matters in this industry. She took the badge from my hand. Her fingers brushed mine, and in that fleeting contact, I felt a sense of relief that I had been denied for months. She did not smile, but her eyes softened with a look of quiet, profound understanding. She knew what this had cost me, not just in business, but in the final painful severance of the man I had raised. "I am not taking this out of obligation, James," she said, pinning the badge to her lapel with precise movements. "I am taking this because I know exactly where the vulnerabilities are, and I have already drafted a plan to expand our reach into the Mediterranean ports. I am going to make this company the most formidable logistics force in the world, and I am going to do it by rewarding talent, not kinship." I walked back to the window, feeling the weight of the last few months lifting from my shoulders. The office, once a place of tension and hidden schemes, now felt like a command center for a future that was finally within my reach. I had lost a son to his own greed, but I had regained my company, and more importantly, my own sense of purpose. I watched as one of our largest ships pulled away from the berth, its bow carving through the dark water with absolute certainty. My legacy was not a name on a building or a share in a bank. It was this, the movement, the scale, the relentless, honest grind of an empire that refused to break. I felt the sharp, cold peace that only comes after a war has been won and the ground has been cleared. I had survived the hostile takeover, the attempted medical incarceration, and the utter dissolution of my personal life. But as I stood there listening to Natalie already discussing logistics protocols with her team on her private line, I knew that the best chapters of this life were still ahead. I went to my private safe and retrieved a small worn leather journal. Inside, I kept the records of the very first contract I had ever secured, long before the global empire, long before the boardroom battles. I opened it to the last page, the paper aged and fragile. I took a fountain pen and wrote a final entry for this chapter of my life. I acknowledged the pain, the betrayal, and the necessity of the destruction, but I did not dwell on them. I was turning the page. The rot was gone. The foundation was rock solid. And tomorrow I would wake up in a world that was entirely my own to command. The empire was untouchable, not because it was invincible, but because it was built on a foundation that could no longer be corrupted. I closed the journal, placed it back into the safe, and looked at the reflection in the window. The man looking back was hardened, yes, but he was also free. The transition was complete. My seat as the chairman was secure, and I would now watch as the new generation, led by a woman of steel and substance, took the helm. I was finally truly at peace. Everything had been restored, not to how it was before, but to how it was always meant to be. The horizon was waiting. I was ready to sail into it, completely and utterly in control of my own destiny.